In Part 1 of this series, Two-Way Survival Radios, we first discussed the findings of the EMP Commission, that an EMP event could potentially wipe out 90% of America's population. Then we discussed the general types of amateur and consumer two-way radios survivors will use to communicate with like-minded others during and after a global disaster. Here we see a picture of a family in their Cold War-era shelter. But we need to ask ourselves, given that this strategy has never actually been tested, is it the best way to prepare? This is a critical question because it defines how we intend to survive a major disaster and the technologies we'll employ to do it. Or in other words, are Cold War sheltering strategies still the best way to plan for the future? Today, most preparedness sheltering strategies are still rooted in a Cold War strategy called NBC, which stands for Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical. In recent years, it has evolved into NBC plus E, for nuclear, biological, chemical, and earthquake. But what about other natural causes besides earthquakes? Do we need to prepare for them as well? Absolutely, and that's history talking. On September 1, 1859, a solar superstorm called the Carrington event slammed into Earth, causing damage and fire in telegraph systems all across America and Europe. Telegraphy equipment was damaged, and telegraph wires across the globe caught fire, setting off numerous wildfires. If another Carrington event happened today, modern life as we know it would cease to exist. Likewise, the massive earthquake and tsunami that struck Japan on March 11, 2011, pushed modern technologies aside as though they never existed. The point being that natural disasters need to play a greater role in your preparedness efforts, because they are equal to, if not greater than, the magnitude of man-made disasters. However, when the two are combined, this is when we experience the worst-case scenarios. It is this worst-case scenario that compelled co-author Dwayne W. Brayton and I to devote 3 entire chapters of Radio Free Earth to the threat of man-made and natural electromagnetic pulse EMP events and attacks, so that survivors can avoid or mitigate the damage they'll do to survival two-way radios. Is this level of planning something that can be dismissed as overkill? Not if you listen seriously to what our government has to say. In a 2017 executive report by the Congressional EMP Commission, they state, a long-term outage owing to EMP could disable most critical supply chains, leaving the U.S. population living in conditions similar to centuries past, prior to the advent of electrical power. This is a powerful statement, but the next paragraph in their report says it all. In the 1800s, the U.S. population was less than 60 million, and those people had many skills and assets necessary for survival without today's infrastructure. Therefore, instead of dwelling on untested Cold War NBC plus E strategies, let's turn the clock back to the 1800s. The pioneers who settled America were determined and stout-hearted people. Theirs was a low-tech world, and it worked for them. They didn't have bottled water, buckets of freeze-dried emergency food, and mylar-thin space-age emergency blankets. Rather, what they had was common sense. Unlike the me and mine approach that dominates Cold War sheltering strategies, they subscribed to the ancient idiom, "There is strength in numbers." This is why they gathered together in large groups such as wagon trains, because they did the math. For predators, a handful of defenders armed with hand-loaded muskets was a tactical issue. Conversely, facing 100 or more determined pioneers with hand-loaded muskets meant having to attack a wall of death. Ergo, they would move on to a softer target. This brings us to a defining question. How will modern, high-tech Americans organize with like-minded others in the aftermath of a global disaster? Again, the idiom, "There is strength in numbers," will be the driving force. The only difference is that future survivors will need to adopt the common-sense approach of America's stout-hearted pioneers. Therefore, we ask, in the aftermath of a global disaster, how will future survivors organize? While time will tell how future survivors sort themselves out, we can possibly expect that the three most common types of survival organization they will use will be small groups and teams, large groups, clans and tribes, and self-sustaining communities. So let's take a closer look at the three. Small groups and teams will typically consist of 3 to 7 members on foot. The ability to cover great distances will favor highly mobile backpackers. Shared leadership decision-making will prevail. Their subsistence will depend on survival supplies and scavenging. Many of these groups will originate with Cold War-based shelter strategies, but once their shelters are no longer tenable, they'll need to search for survival options on the surface, and movement will be their greatest security need. Consequently, they will overnight in ad hoc shelters or bivouac without cover. That will be effective to a point, but their vulnerability to large groups of predators will still persist. Consequently, many small groups and teams will seek to join with like-minded others. The need for greater security will be the overarching motivation to organize large groups, clans, or tribes of no less than 8 members from multiple small groups and teams. These large groups, clans, and tribes will acquire vehicles and pack animals. They will not be led in a democratic form of shared leadership. Rather, they will be led by emergent leaders or dominant couples. Unlike small groups and teams, large groups will move less often as they will be equipped for well-defended overnight sheltering situations or lengthy encampments. Like small groups and teams, they will also depend on packaged supplies and scavenging for subsistence. With the need for greater security achieved by the formation of large groups, clans, and tribes, the next greater need will be that of self-sufficiency. Consequently, many will seek to form self-sustaining communities by joining with like-minded others. With their security needs met, large groups, clans, and tribes will face a new overarching need for a long-term solution, that being a self-sustaining community, which will typically have a membership of 100 to 150 members. Why 150? This is called Dunbar's number, in honor of British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who first proposed it in the 1990s. How does it apply here? In a community of 150, each member will know the others, and therefore be able to maintain trusted and stable social relationships. Because self-sustaining communities will be formed from multiple large groups, clans, and tribes, these communities will inherit a large fleet of vehicles, along with riding animals and pack animals. While the emergent leaders or dominant couples of the multiple large groups, clans, or tribes will continue in some form of representation, the need for a big tent single vision for the entire community will lead to the formation of a democratically elected leadership. Therefore, a winning campaigner for community leader will likely have a plan that inspires confidence in the creation of housing for families and productive farming and ranching operations. As a result, these communities will enjoy a basic level of self-sufficiency, and they will also rely on scavenging for other needs such as security and medical supplies. This brings us to a very interesting question. Beyond basic needs and security, what will be the overarching need for self-sustaining communities? Of all the questions we've asked and answered so far in this series, this question will be the most important of all for those of you watching this program. The answer to this question will likely be the one that determines the post-disaster fate of our species, is answered in the third and final part of this series, Survivors and Radios. Until the next time, remember this: Radio Free Earth will pay for itself many times over with your initial radio purchases, and the sooner you begin, the more you'll save. To purchase our book, Radio Free Earth, online, visit amazon.radiofreeearth.org. We offer 3 different editions: a low-cost black and white edition and 2 collector-grade all-color special editions. For the Radio Free Earth team, this is Marshall Masters, and if things go sideways, we'll catch you on the 40.